Welcome, everyone. My name is Bonnie Liggett, and I'm the Director of Content Acquisition here at RDC. Today, we're going to take a look at the marijuana industry and the continued conflict between state and federal laws. What is changing, and what can banks do to arm themselves with the best information, policies, and procedures to mitigate risk, whether or not they choose to do business with a marijuana-related business, an MRB. We'll also touch on industrial hemp production and what has changed and how this has created some additional confusion for financial institutions. But first, I thought we'd take a quick stroll through our historical past, looking at some of the seeds of growth in the cannabis industry. In the 1930s, scrutiny of the use of marijuana really started to take hold with the propaganda film Reefer Madness, which was intended to show how high school students are lured by pushers to try marijuana, leading to all types of calamities and disasters. In the 1950s, we see tougher possession laws emerging and a growing concern over the use of cannabis. The 60s, the age of free love, drugs, and rock and roll, brought into focus the growing division between generations and began to pave the road for the actions that were taken by the Nixon administration in the 70s. Those actions being an intro to the Controlled Substance Act signed into law classifying drugs based on their medical application and potential for abuse. Marijuana found itself on Schedule 1 alongside drugs that are considered the most dangerous and pose high risk for addiction with little evidence of medical benefits. And so began the war on drugs. However, there was a slight pause in the 1970s when 11 states did decriminalize the possession of marijuana, and President Jimmy Carter running on a campaign of decriminalizing marijuana. But then again, the tide turned. President Reagan reinforced and expanded many of Nixon's war on drugs policy. And in 1984, his wife, Nancy Reagan, launched a really effective campaign to just say no to drugs. By the 90s, there was a renewed movement to look at marijuana as a drug used for medical purposes. And during the 90s, we saw states like California, Alaska, Washington, and Oregon move to legalize medicinal use. In 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to introduce recreational use. And in 2013, we saw the Farm Bill Act passed and signed into law in February of 2014, allowing states to produce hemp under a pilot program. We also saw the issuance of the Cole Memo, creating a hands-off policy for the Department of Justice to not go after financial institutions that chose banks with MRBs. In 2016, California legalized adult use. As progress was being made at the state level, the federal government actually took a step back, rescinding the Cole Memo in 2018, causing financial institutions to take additional protective measures to mitigate risk and pushing back hard on doing business with MRBs. In 2018, we saw Canada become the second country to legalize countrywide and the signing of the 2018 Farm Bill, moving non-psychoactive cannabis or hemp off of Schedule 1. And before I take a deeper dive into a couple of these milestones, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention the number 420, as here we are in April of 2020, and how that number became associated with marijuana. What I found were a number of theories of the origins of 420, including Police Code for Marijuana Smoking in Progress, the California Penal Code 420, Bob Dylan's song Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35, and a stretch being that if you multiply 12 times 35, you get 420. All seem plausible. However, the true story is completely different. It really was started with 5 Marin County teenage boys in the 1970s who met at 4:20 p.m. by a statue on their high school campus to enjoy some high times. While this seems to be the most improbable of the theories, because how does a meeting of 5 teenage boys become viral long before the age of social media? But it did. One of the parents of the boys was a real estate broker who helped the Grateful Dead acquire and manage rehearsal space. Additionally, one of the brothers of the boys was a friend with Grateful Dead's bassist Phil Lesh. So between the two connections and the continuing use of the code, around the band, it caught on and was adopted by roadies and fans alike, even passing up flyers at concerts with the number 420. So while this is really very interesting, how does this sort of tie back to our topic today? It really has a lot to do with risk mitigation. The use of 420 was all about avoiding risk to get caught, a way of communicating a message based on certain facts. Without knowing what 420 meant and their own policies and procedures, there was a greater chance of alarms being raised. Financial institutions face conflicting messages from states and the federal government with regard to cannabis laws, forcing banks to take on very strict due diligence procedures to mitigate the risk of exposure to federal law enforcement. Banks must be able to prove the provenance of deposits to ensure that they do not come under scrutiny for money laundering, but in doing so are also faced with the high cost of deploying due diligence. From initiating suspicious activity reports to the development of robust screening and monitoring, financial institutions are arming themselves against law enforcement actions and reputational risk. Industrial hemp is another area where banks must be aware of new legislative developments and how that differs from businesses like dispensaries that work directly with the marijuana. In February 2014, President Obama signed the Federal Agricultural Reform and Risk Management Act of 2013, defining industrial hemp as distinct from marijuana that comes from a different species of cannabis plant, allowing for institutions of higher education or state departments of agriculture to participate in research and pilot programs. 33 states and Puerto Rico introduced pro-hemp legislation, and 24 states defined industrial hemp as distinct from other strains of cannabis, removing barriers to its production. But in the end, with no clear message from the federal government and weighing the risk, most banks opted out of doing business with marijuana-related businesses and look to implement due diligence programs to mitigate that risk. So here we are today. As recently as March 6th of this year, banking associations from 49 states and Puerto Rico sent a letter to the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee asking for asking to advance a bill protecting the financial institutions that lend money to the state legal businesses. This comes after the Secure and Fair Enforcement Act, Banking Act, the SAFE Act, which was designed to protect financial institutions in states that have chosen to legalize cannabis from the possibility of federal prosecution. The bill was passed in September of 2019 in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, the Senate has not chosen to bring that bill forward. But sentiment is changing. However, public opinion on legalizing marijuana is changing, with the majority of Americans now in agreement that marijuana should be legal. Of course, the hope is that increasing this sentiment will eventually translate to law and at a minimum, allow the SAFE Bank Act to be reintroduced in some form to allow banks to not be in fear of violating federal laws when banking with MRBs. As of today, the majority of states have legalized medical use marijuana. 29 states have decriminalized possession, and 13 states and territories and DC have legalized adult use. Only 3 states and 1 territory still deems marijuana as illegal. Those are Nebraska, Idaho, South Dakota, and American Samoa. Another game changer has been the removal of hemp as a controlled substance, opening the door for industrial hemp production and the growth of the CBD market. The estimated revenues in the US for hemp industry are likely to exceed $2.5 billion by the year 2022. Revenue for the industrial hemp, cannabis, and CBDs is projected to grow into the billions over the next several years. But does that really open the door for banks to jump into engaging with industrial hemp producers or cannabis MRBs? The answer to that question can be very confusing. With regard to industrial hemp production, while the 2018 Farm Bill removed the hemp as a Schedule 1 drug, it did not make hemp production legal across the board, as states may continue to make the production of hemp illegal. Additionally, the process to move to the 2018 Farm Bill rules includes states registering with the U.S. Department of Agriculture prior to the expiration of the 2014 Farm Bill, which expires at the end of October 2020 before the 2020 growing season. States that do not register with the USDA will then be deemed to be operating illegally. 20 states have opted, as of today, to continue under the 2014 pilot rules for the 2020 growing season, while 12 straight states have been approved by the USDA. Other states are in varying other states are in varying stages of the process and have asked the government to extend the 2014 pilot through the 2020 growing season. But as of today, there's no extension that's been put forward, which puts banks again in the crosshairs for determining if they continue to bank with industrial hemp producers who have not completed the registration process, as their business would then be deemed illegal. But it's not all bad news for MRBs who are operating in states where the sale and use of marijuana is legal. Over the past couple of years, financial institutions have started showing the willingness to bank with MRBs. The percentage of banks continues to rise. It is now slightly more than 10%. Credit unions and other depository institutions banking with MRBs are also on the rise. Another sign is the increase in suspicious activity reports, signaling that banks are filing SARs per FinCEN guidance to mitigate risk as they opt to do more business with MRBs. As many banks stand at the fork in the road, choosing either to avoid doing business altogether with MRBs or proceeding cautiously, both require the same due diligence with regard to the AML and KYC processes and procedures. So what are some of the ways that banks are arming themselves? Well, first and foremost is really understanding the market, the differences between the federal and state laws for the THC, CBD, and hemp businesses. And as we've seen today, it can be full of mixed messages and no clear path to future united solutions. Developing and implementing robust screening and AI technology solutions to stop businesses from being part of the portfolio of customers, to monitoring those businesses from having identified them as MRBs, but wanting to use technology to watch for unusual transaction behavior. Filing SARs when doing business with an MRB, and engaging your regulators. Going deeper into the communities to get to know the businesses, making visits to brick and mortar dispensaries or production facilities to gauge the legitimacy and develop a more personal relationship. And as part of that risk mitigation, RDC can help. RDC has nearly 40,000 MRBs covering seed to sale businesses, including cultivators, testing labs, manufacturing, distribution, transportation, and dispensaries. We also cover 8,000 persons, including owners, officers, and board members associated with MRBs where available. This highly specialized collection is curated through the monitoring of hundreds of official state and territory websites, including pending and active licenses, a manual review of business applications for ownership information, direct communications with state licensing authorities to access information not readily available on their websites, use of online directories for cross-reference, and to ensure coverage of both legal and doing business names. But RDC is more than this. Combining the highly curated MRB collection with RDC's adverse media screening, financial institutions will also be alerted to businesses that have engaged in criminal activity. An example shown here is where a producer was also cited for mislabeling its edibles, as well as under review for other violations. The futures. So what is next for this growing industry? Even with the continued need for financial institutions to navigate the conflict between state and federal laws, the future looks pretty bright. Trends that are likely to come to the forefront include both diversification and globalization. With regard to diversification, we'll see a growth across different industry sectors, including beverages, edibles, health and beauty, and even cannabis for our pets. We're already seeing an explosive growth in the CBD market as industrial hemp production increases. And we're already seeing a myriad of CBD products lining the shelves today. We'll be seeing a jockeying for brand recognition as manufacturers and distributors begin to consolidate and gain traction in the consumer marketplace. Globalization. And while many of our MRBs we see today are locally owned, there will be a consolidation of many of these local shops into national brands and the march toward globalization as other countries are already poised to move closer to legalization. Later this month, a colleague will be taking a deeper dive into both globalization and diversification. I also wanted to mention something because we're living in very unusual times right now. And there's been a big step forward by states and coming together of dispensaries and communities by classifying marijuana businesses as being essential. Dispensaries at the same time are trying to manage social distancing with curbside pickups, advanced payments with debit cards. This is also further highlights the need for federal and state lawmakers to really come together and protect banks doing business with MRBs is to not put at risk their shared customer base through the handling of cash transactions. But together we can make a difference. At RDC, our sole mission is to prevent criminal infiltration of the world's financial system, whether it's through the continued expansion of our MRB special collection or combining that information with the world's largest collection of powerful decision-ready intelligence and world-class risk and compliance protection services. RDC is ready to help financial institutions worldwide meet whatever due diligence and regulatory challenges they are faced with today and beyond. So thanks you so much for your time today. And if you have any questions about our MRB collection or other RDC services, please contact info@rdc.com. And thank you again.